Hello, and welcome to episode 180 on the Everyday Joy podcast. I'm your host, Joy Ravella. So excited to be talking about something today, and it's got to do with a time in your life where you really got mad at yourself. We often talk about our feelings of anger and frustration with others, but today focusing in on that moment where you felt really upset with the way you handled something. Now, if you can imagine that in your mind, it's going to be really handy because we are going to unpack it in a really new, creative way later on this episode. My name is Joy Ravella. I'm your host, and I'm so excited to be hanging out with you on the Everyday Joy podcast. Let's get into it.
In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry. This is found in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26 in the New International Version.
I've got the incredible Gig here in studio with me. Gig, I can smell the delicious sourdough just sitting on the other side of this. I'm so hungry. The moment we finish recording this.
She's eating it.
I'm eating it.
Yep.
Thank you so much for bringing that in. For the listeners who've heard you as Gig the storyteller, as Gig the mum, as Gig the wife, tell me a little bit about your pursuits outside of your day-to-day role. You've got a lot of hobbies and side hustles.
I love my side hustles.
Yep.
I do. And bread is something and food is something I'm very passionate about. I believe food is medicine. And I follow very much along the way. Well, I've done a lot of research into the Amish people and what they eat. And medically what they take into their body compared to what we do as a Western society. And so 10 years ago, my husband started a sourdough starter. He made it himself, and it's probably a bit more than 10 now. And so we've continued doing that. And at the moment, because I will make it, and I've got a few people who are celiacs and who can actually have this bread, because when you let the bread prove at the right amount of time, all the enzymes break down and your gut will be able to handle that.
Wow.
Because we've genetically modified our wheat so much, it's now poison. If you go to Italy and you're gluten intolerant, you can eat everything there because they use ancient grains.
That makes so much sense. My sister and I went for a little short trip there. Too short. We saved up and we were there literally 4 days and flew back to...
Way too short.
Way too short. We should have saved up for longer and gone there for longer. Anyway, I noticed that because I was having I was having a lot of pasta and dough, and I was fine.
You weren't bloating?
Yes. Bloating is such a big thing for me. I really struggle with bloating, which is why I avoid having too many carbs throughout the day.
Yes.
And the moment I get home, I'm like, that's when I load up because I can just sit there with my bloated belly on the couch.
That's it.
But wow, that's incredible.
So when you eat my bread, you won't bloat.
I'm so excited.
So very exciting. Very exciting. So passionate about food, bread, and eating what we need to eat to. Well, God's given us everything we need. We need to stop messing with it.
Yeah. And you know what? I think actually that really ties in well with today's conversation. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. And I think the reason why it ties in a little bit is because I think there's a certain process to human emotions. There's a certain process. And when we try to hijack it, or we try to make it more efficient, or make it bigger or smaller, and all those sorts of things that humans do, we often meddle with something and it never really goes the way we want. And for me, one of the things that I see in this verse is that it doesn't say don't be angry. It says you will be angry, but in your anger, do not sin. And I think what we often do culturally is we try to stop ourselves from getting angry in the first place. And I think that's where, same thing with the whole gluten and bread situation. We miss the whole process.
Yes.
God doesn't say don't be angry. He just says in your anger, do not sin. And I think that's something that really jumps out at me today. What about you, Gig?
Yeah, absolutely. And I need to put in a little extra bit on this, because if you read the in your anger, do not sin, do not let the sun go down while you're still angry. Verse 27 says, and do not give the devil a foothold. And I think that little bit at the end cements it, because, and God sees us as, we're not robots. We're not robots by any means. He's given us all the emotions in the world to deal with. And I know for me, the quickest way for the devil to get in is through my anger. And it's my quickest emotion. I think it's most people's quickest emotion to get to is anger. And it's so easy to sit in it. It's not fair, blah, 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 blah. So don't let the sun go down, but don't give the devil a foothold.
Yeah, because you give him a foothold and he'll just...
Oh, he'll go on for days. Give him an inch, he'll take a mile.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And I think that's the thing. We've got to fight that initial little battle at the start. Let go of the anger or deal with it in a healthy way.
Yep.
Don't let it fester, because it's a much bigger thing to deal with down the line as you let it build and build. Have you got a story, Gig, in your life of how this has come to be or has fleshed out in some way?
Yeah, there's a statement that I really connect with, and it's remember, no one makes you angry, you allow yourself to become angry. And I read that years ago, because it's like, well, you've ticked me off, you've done the wrong thing, and now I'm in a bad mood. Where I read that and went, hang on, I'm going to own this. Yeah, you've maybe made me be aggravated, but I'm not going to own that, and I'm not going to take it on board, because God doesn't do anger. He does forgiveness, grace and mercy. So I'm going to show that towards you, and I'm going to take on some, resilience, a spoonful of concrete, and say, praise God and keep moving. That's not always as easy as that. Just rolled off my tongue so easily. It's not always that easy, but I got to remember, and especially myself, I get so angry at myself, Joy. I'm not an angry person by nature, and even if my kids really tick me off, I'm a calm, and I find the calm mum is the scary mum. And it just brings it all back. But I really get ticked off at myself, and I verbally go at myself. What have you done? Don't be an idiot, blah, blah, blah. And that's another thing. Don't let the sun go down on yourself. Put yourself in the right place. Don't let the devil get a foothold, because he knows that's the way he does it with me. Stand your ground in Christ and go, I'm not going to have it. I'm not going to have a bar.
Yeah. That reminds me of a time in my life, actually not too long ago, where I struggled with that very thing. So I had a situation where I felt like I didn't advocate for myself well enough. I didn't handle the situation well enough. And I had this whole thing where I was like, Joy, you know who you are. You know how you should have behaved in this situation. You should have had a stronger spine in this. You should have said those words. You should have done this. And I was rehearsing and replaying that situation in my mind, as you do. And you're like, well, I should have said this. I should have done that. And I lived in the world of should have for a really long time.
Yes.
And so this is how it played out in my life, practically speaking. So we talk about the devil having a foothold. So what I had allowed into my mind was the thought that I was angry at myself because I felt like I had let myself down. I had let myself down. Joy, you know better. You are better.
Yep.
You should have done better. And so that was the foothold. And that leaked into every area of my life like this. So I became hyper vigilant with all my relationships and all my friendships.
Yep.
I really lost the softness, because I was like, well,
you're on standby the whole time.
Yeah, I'm like, well, I'm not going to let that happen again. And so spikes and walls went up.
Yeah.
And I got short with everyone.
Yep.
So that was one thing. The other thing that happened was my body and the physiological response. And I think in previous episodes with Adam, we talked about this as well.
Yep.
Couldn't sleep, bloating palooza, because I was just kind of on edge the whole time. My body was holding a lot of tension. And also spiritually, it really impacted me, because when I was so busy beating myself up, there was no room for God's grace.
Absolutely. That's that foothold.
That's where it took me. So if you're listening right now, word of caution, from that first initial thought to where it took me about 3 months later, it's still taking me time.
So how did you get out of that?
That's such a good question, Gig. I got out of it by realizing what Jesus was to me in that situation and in that room. Hard to explain, but I kind of looked at that whole scenario again. I was only looking at it through my lens. What I said, what I didn't say, what happened, what didn't happen. And I reimagined the whole thing with Jesus in the room.
Wow.
And that was a very helpful exercise for me, because it helped me realize that he was always there.
Yep.
And he's always been there since. And I think it didn't do anything like super radical overnight, But what it helped my brain realize was that I'm not the only one in this, that I'm part of something bigger.
Yeah.
And I think that was what allowed me to let go and to forgive and to move on. So, yeah, I don't know, maybe for you listening, there was a particular moment or thing that made you get angry at yourself, whether it was with your kids or at work, or I don't know what that looks like. Go back and reimagine that situation and imagine and picture, where was Jesus standing? What was his expression? What was he doing? Because I think the kind of Jesus I pictured was the one of love and grace, who just had his arms around me and was just comforting me.
Yep.
And I was so hard on myself in a space where I knew Jesus wouldn't be.
Yes.
And I'm like, well, I should treat myself the way Jesus would treat me.
Absolutely. If we all did that, wow, life would be so much easier.
Yeah. Whew. Bit of a conversation.
Well done.
So as we come to the end of today's conversation, I just love how you touched on that whole fact of learning not to be angry with yourself to the point that you give the devil a foothold. For someone who's maybe really upset at themselves as well, they've really messed up, and I've gone into this a little bit, but for you, Gig, what would be your encouragement or perspective for that person?
I just love what you said. As soon as you said, I felt like Jesus was, reimagine it with Jesus in the room. And I think parents can relate to that when you're watching your children in a room and they're being, something's happening to them that's not fair. Or they're saying something, or they're putting their foot in it, or whatever. And as a parent, you just look at them with absolute unconditional love. And, and I think parents can relate to that. In parents of animals, parents of anyone, if you're, just imagine you're looking at someone that you really adore and respect, and how would you wouldn't put a weight on their shoulder and just down them. I think, that's blown my mind. I'm reimagining that situation. Jesus in the room, huge.
As we come to the end of today's episode, I think that's the application I'd love for us to zone in on. Think about a time in your life where you felt like you really let yourself down, where you've been struggling to forgive yourself. And my thought to you is, can you take some time out today to reimagine the situation, but imagining where Jesus would have been in the room? What would his expression have been? And what would his tone and gestures, all those sorts of things, what would that have been like? And I think it's also really important to remind ourselves of who Jesus is as well. Because if you're imagining someone who's just really angry and disappointed and disinterested, I'm not sure if you've got the right picture of Jesus. His arms are wide open. He might be a little sad, and he might be a little bit like, oh, I know that's not the right way, but he's always comforting. He's always near. He's always loving. So that picture of Jesus, what would he have been like in that room? Something to think about. It's such a great verse that we are focusing on today. In your anger, do not sin. Don't let the sun go down when you're angry. And if you want to know more about Gig, if you want to know more about today's episode, go back and listen to the previous episodes with her. Episode 126 is a really good example of that. Hey, I look forward to catching up again tomorrow on the Everyday Joy podcast. If you haven't already, do leave a written 5-star review. Catch up then.